Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to this YouTube live stream on extreme weather. We're going to do our best to answer as many questions as we can around heat waves, climate change, extreme weather. We'll let all of you join on the live stream. I'm Isabella, Head of Climate Policy here at WWF UK.
And I'm Lucy. I head up the team in our Conservation Programmes Department that leads our programmatic work in the UK. And please feel free to send in any questions via the chat as we go through the session today, and we'll answer as many of those as we can. So, Isabella, what's the difference between a heat wave and just normal summer temperatures?
Well, I'm sure lots of people are following the news at the moment, and we've seen a huge amount of coverage about the heat waves we're seeing across the globe at the moment. And even just today, we've had an updated news story that's kind of really highlighting that July is going to be the hottest July on record. And the science is really clear that the heat wave that we're seeing and the extreme weather we're seeing around the world is made worse by climate change, and that is directly linked to the burning of fossil fuels, emitting emissions, which is creating much hotter temperatures and much hotter heat waves. And we're seeing records being broken day after day. So yeah, very much in a heat wave at the moment in many places around the world.
And what about the fact it's actually quite cold in England at the moment?
Yeah, so confusing, I suppose, in terms of the heat waves we're seeing in other places. June this year was really hot in the UK. There were many heat wave records broken. And we know that climate change is not just extreme heat. I know we talk about global warming, but we know that extreme weather and climate change means we see a variety of different weather patterns. So we do see these extreme heat waves. And I remember last summer being in London on the 40 degree heat day, which was really overwhelming. And we're seeing more flooding, more intense rain. We're seeing colder spells in the winter. And weather forecasters from the UN have forecasted that this sort of more intense and more uncertain weather is the new norm that we're seeing, and climate change is making that worse at the moment. So, yeah. So, Lucy, we had a question around, we're seeing the impact of this, I suppose. People are really suffering. We're seeing that kind of across the globe at the moment. And yeah, we're having kind of really direct impacts on people. In fact, I think the heat wave last summer, there's a study that's come out that showed 61,000 people died because of the impacts of that heat wave, which is really devastating. So you're also very kind of working in the nature space. So what's the impact on nature as well in terms of this extreme weather?
Yeah, so climate change and extreme weather is having a really heavy impact on nature, both in terms of the kind of extremes of temperature, but also things you mentioned about kind of drought and the impact of things like wildfires on the habitat that nature, kind of depends on. And to give just one example, so bees are being really heavily impacted by climate change. We know that they're obviously really important in terms of pollinating kind of wildflowers and crops that we rely on to eat, but they can't regulate their temperature. So as the temperature increases, they're really heavily impacted. And we've seen, just if we give one example, in East Anglia, that 17 species have already become extinct and more are kind of really in rapid decline. So we really need to make sure that we're kind of considering what impact that climate change is having on nature, and that we are looking to restore and mitigate the impact. So, for example, we are supporting work in a number of places across the UK to restore wildflower meadows, and those really providing that habitat for pollinators, including bees. So one of the questions we've had a lot is, what can we do to mitigate climate change?
So, yeah, there's, I suppose, two elements of this. There's what can we do to stop contributing to this problem? So what can we do to really mitigate the impacts? And predominantly, we need to stop emitting emissions. So we need to move away from our reliance on fossil fuels, which we know driving up energy bills. They're having really serious impacts on our world and our nature. And we need to really kind of work with governments and businesses and individuals to shift to a climate friendly future. So what that looks like is we need to really accelerate renewable energy and wind and solar. We need to decarbonize our homes and the way that we travel and our transport. And here at WWF, we predominantly in the climate change team are holding government account on their delivery on their climate change plans. And the areas that we really focus on are making sure we've got the investment to get on track for net zero and for climate change. So making sure we're getting public and private investment, which is unlocking a lot of opportunities around green jobs and green opportunities in the UK. We also work on agriculture. We know that farmers are really on the front line in terms of the impacts of extreme weather. And they also are really impacted, but they have a role to play in terms of supporting them and making sure that we move to regenerative, sustainable ways of farming so that we can reduce the impact in terms of climate change. And then our homes, and this again really links back to this extreme weather. The UK has some of the worst housing in the whole of the EU. And if we improve the quality of those homes, we're reducing our risk from extreme heat and cold spells. We're reducing people's energy bills, and we're really driving down emissions. So we need to see a lot in terms of improving that quality of homes and making sure we decarbonize them. And then I suppose on the other side, there's kind of the adaptation to climate change. And just recently, the government published their plans around adaptation, which is their plan on how they are going to cope with climate change and extreme weather. And sadly, we're really not doing enough. Their own climate advisors criticised the plans and said we need to be investing much more into how we're mitigating, and nature is a huge ally for us in terms of what it can offer to help reduce those impacts, but also again back to housing and how we protect people in terms of this extreme weather. So there's a lot we could be doing, and we need more urgent action from government at the moment. We're off track on our targets, and we know that if we delay, this increases in cost. So we need to make sure we're acting now. And I think often just on that, we often get asked what individuals can do to mitigate and what action they can do. I always encourage people to go and have a look. WWF has an amazing carbon footprint calculator where you can individually calculate your own emissions and see where your impact is. And it has really nice sort of tips on how you can address that. So I always think if you kind of start with one or two of those and try and integrate them into your life, whether that's kind of trying to walk more, use, public transport, whether you sort of build in some plant-based meals in the week, or switch kind of renewable energy provider, then you can kind of keep going down the line in those actions. And yeah, I think we all have a role to play, and also your voice is really powerful in terms of how we make sure governments and businesses are held to account in terms of climate change at the moment. Great. So I think we had another question through Instagram in terms of how can nature help mitigate and adapt to climate change?
Yeah, so nature can play a really fundamental role, both in terms of mitigating climate change, but also helping us to adapt to the impact of extreme weather events, so drought and flooding. And there's also the co-benefits of restoring biodiversity and providing a space for people to go and enjoy nature. So I think we often think about forests and the role that they can play in kind of locking up carbon, but a lot of other habitats also play that same role. So for example, seagrass meadows, they once used to line the British coast. We've lost 92% of our seagrass meadows. And one thing that we're actively supporting at WWF is the restoration of those seagrass meadows. So we're working with Project Seagrass to really demonstrate how you can bring that habitat back to life, and the seagrass is as effective at sequestering carbon as forests. And it also then has co-benefits of helping coastal communities to be more resilient to climate change and supporting biodiversity, so acting as a nursery for fish. So yeah, those kind of real co-benefits of restoring nature and helping us to address both the climate crisis and the nature crisis. Just to give one other example, so we know that previous efforts to kind of reduce the risk of flooding have very much focused on straightening kind of our river channels and trying to get water as quickly as we can off the land. But actually there's real benefit in kind of holding water back in a catchment and slowing the flow so that you don't get all the water reaching those downstream areas and increasing the risk of flooding. And one of the ways that nature can really help to do that is the reintroduction of beavers that we've seen in Scotland, and we're increasingly seeing in England now. And they're really kind of amazing ecosystem engineers. They create dams on the main river, they hold back and create kind of flooded areas, which is great for biodiversity. It holds back that water. So yeah, you know, much more cost effectively than you know, installing a really heavy concrete flood defence. And actually those wetland areas that they create can be really effective at storing carbon as well. So it can store 3 times more carbon than those meadows if they were just kind of as they were before, yeah, kind of flooding. So yeah, I think nature is a really effective and kind of both in terms of cost and co-benefits way of helping to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Yeah, it's really inspiring. And actually I went and visited a farm the other day that was looking at kind of nature-friendly farming and regenerative agriculture, and yeah, it was really interesting to see the stats of, you know, how reintroducing nature is actually going to really supporting and protecting crops in terms of the impacts that they're seeing, and also yeah, the kind of benefits that's having for the local area and the role that it's playing. I found it really inspirational.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. You assume that shifting towards a more regenerative approach in terms of agriculture would lower yields, but I think often they find exactly the opposite, that you're boosting soil health. Again, that's helping to kind of hold water back in the catchment, so you're reducing the risk of flooding, you're storing more carbon. And actually there's a real benefit for the nutrition that you're getting from that food that's produced in those systems as well. So actually what's coming off that land is healthier for people to eat and more nutritious than some of the intensive agricultural systems.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing that would be great to see more of in terms of that adaptation strategy, I suppose, from government, in terms of, yeah, you know, we are seeing this extreme weather and we need to do everything we can to kind of reduce that. So yeah, making sure nature's at the heart of that is really important. Yeah,
and I think government's got quite strong ambitions in terms of kind of reaching net zero and nature restoration, but I think agriculture is one of the areas where those ambitions are weaker and there's a lot more that could be done. We've obviously got the new agricultural subsidy scheme that's coming in through the Environment Land Management Scheme, but making sure that there is that real kind of significant investment in some of the upper tiers that are more focused on that regenerative farming approach, and also kind of landscape scale outcomes. So you're not just looking at an individual farm, you're looking at what actually happens across a landscape, and that's when you really start to get those kind of outputs and impacts that you need to see to address the scale of the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, I think we've had a question come in from the live stream.
So this is one for you, Isabella. Is there a difference between El Nino and climate change?
It's a good question. So El Nino is a sort of natural weather pattern, and in general we see global temperature rises. So particularly kind of in the oceans are warming, and we see global temperature rises. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be warmer in the UK. There's nuances in there that, you know, we might see more extreme colder winters, and some parts of the world have more extremes in terms of kind of rainfall and flooding, but overall it's a sort of general warming of the world. And I think what we're really witnessing and seeing at the moment is climate change is adding on top of that, and it's making it more intense. So we've got this double whammy of, El Nino, that's a natural occurrence that we are experiencing, and then on top of that, because of the impact in terms of fossil fuels and climate change and sort of the trapping of that heat, we're seeing this more extreme weather. And I think scientists have been really clear on this at the moment, in terms of, until we stop our reliance on fossil fuels and we stop emitting these emissions, the sort of matching of the El Nino effect and climate change is making this much more extreme. So it's kind of the joining up of that together that we're seeing at the moment, which is why we're seeing some of these really record temperatures around the world, and people are really kind of being impacted by it.
I mean, we see that there's quite a lot of negative media coverage. Do you kind of feel like there's still hope?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question for me at the moment, and I personally am feeling, there's a lot in the news at the moment around extreme weather. We're seeing records being broken. It is quite overwhelming, and from my perspective, we know that public concern for climate change really spikes when we see these extreme weather events, and we know what we need to do. We need to reduce our emissions. There's a lot out there in terms of what government can do and businesses can do. So I still have hope in the fact that I think there are some amazing people working in this space. We know the benefits. This is one of the things that I find, when you look at stuff like the moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and what we're seeing at the moment in the energy sector, that moving to more efficient homes and moving away from, volatile fossil fuels has benefits across the board in terms of it drives down our emissions. It sort of reduces the cost of energy bills, which we really need to see at the moment with the dual kind of cost of living crisis at the moment. And it also has big benefits in terms of health, and also benefits in terms of the economy. And we know that kind of, if we don't act now, those costs double for future generations. So I think it's quite hard in terms of the sort of news story at the moment and the extreme weather and the heat waves, but I would kind of really encourage people to use that energy in order to kind of really hold government to account. We need to be moving faster. We can all do things as individuals, and we've still got time to do it. We just need to make sure we're moving at pace. So how about you on the nature side as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really positive that there is ambitious targets that government have. I think what we're lacking is that real roadmap to get there. I think there's so much appetite. There's so much kind of, exciting work happening, that it's really, how do we channel that? How do we build on it? How do we, I think we mentioned previously about kind of match the public investment with private subsidies. And I think, there's all these developing environmental markets at the moment, so carbon, nature, freshwater and nutrient trading. How do we bring all of that together so we're more efficiently delivering the real kind of outcomes that we need to see, rather than having things that potentially can be pulling in different directions? So I think it's about aligning all of those different funding, but also the policy, and collaborating, working together. So even us as NGOs, not working just as sort of we work very closely with local delivery partners that really understand the context of the places that they're working and have those relationships with the local communities. So that's really important in terms of making sure that kind of what we're doing is sustainable, and the right thing for the local communities that live in those places, and really delivers them benefits.
Yeah, and I suppose on your negative point as well, something that I feel very strongly about in terms of, I think there have been some more negative stories in the news around kind of net zero, and we've seen really strong business support and strong support across the board in terms of letters going in around, this is the opportunity from a business perspective, and sort of there was a report that said net zero is the economic opportunity of the 21st century. And I think what I'm really keen, this is a legally binding target. It is in law, and we do have the Climate Change Act, and we have the Committee on Climate Change that each year is doing a progress report and holding government to account. So at the moment, for me, it's like the pace at which we're delivering, and we need to be quicker. And if people are not moving fast enough, it's a missed opportunity. But there are some amazing things happening, and we need to really focus on those small wins of how we can drive emissions down now, and build to that plan as well with government. I think we've had another question come through.
So how has climate change contributed to the current wildfires in Southern Europe?
Yeah, so kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, the UN weather forecasters put out a report recently that showed that hotter temperatures and more intense temperatures are the new norm. So I think something for me is we're sort of seeing these back-to-back extreme weather events, and we're seeing much drier and hotter temperatures, and we're seeing that really across Southern Europe at the moment. So in terms of kind of the conditions for wildfires, that's obviously making it much worse and much more intense. And I think there's obviously, I mean, nature again has a role to play in terms of how we manage that land in a way that hopefully reduces the risk around wildfires. But sadly, we are seeing much intense hotter temperatures, and that is causing, perfect conditions in terms of when a wildfire is spreading much quicker. And I think the thing for me as well is it's this back-to-back of repeated hot days. I think in the past we've seen kind of hot days sort of here and there, but I mean, what we're seeing at the moment in Southern Europe is this kind of back-to-back of really hot days and even hot evenings. I mean, some of the stories that were coming out of America in terms of that temperature, there isn't that kind of respite in terms of temperature. So again, it makes it really hard in terms of tackling these wildfires on that kind of continual heat. And yeah, it must be kind of really terrifying in those countries to be experiencing that.
Definitely. And I think the fact that you're getting less rainfall in summer as well, aren't you? So it's much drier. So those fires, like you say, spread really quickly once they start, because you haven't got that kind of moisture held in the kind of biomass, but also in the landscape to really help to kind of stop the rapid spread. And
I suppose nature has a role in terms of like how you manage those trees and various things throughout the winter, and how you kind of, I suppose, the more green space you have, it also helps bring down temperatures, because they're more kind of urban areas are also driving that up. Yeah, no, definitely. And how resilient those kind of ecosystems are to regenerate after a fire as well. I think the more biodiversity that you have, the more resilient an area is. So that's really important in terms of how you kind of recover after a wildfire as well. Got a few more questions coming in. Keep them going whilst we're on the live stream. For Lucy, so what other partners do WWF work with on climate change and nature restoration? Yeah, so we have a focused programme of work in the UK that is supporting landscape scale restoration that's focused largely on shifting towards regenerative agriculture. We have a seascapes programme that is looking at seagrass restoration and seaweed farming. And then we're looking at how we can kind of bring those programmes of work together into what we're calling a wholescape approach, recognising that land, rivers and sea are integrated, and if we're going to really mitigate climate change, restore nature and meet the needs of people, we need to really do that in an integrated way and look at the kind of trade-offs that will be required and how you manage those most effectively. So in all of those on the ground delivery projects, WWF don't implement those projects directly. We work with local NGOs and organisations. So that's often the Rivers Trust for our landscape projects, or the Wildlife Trust.
We're working with a community seaweed farm in Wales, so that's really looking at kind of stimulating that seaweed production and looking at what market there is for them for those products, which there's a real sort of circular piece then around that seaweed potentially being an alternative lower impact fertilizer, or it can be a feed additive for livestock that can help to reduce methane emissions. So that kind of cyclical kind of reduction in methane emissions and climate change associated with that from livestock. Through our kind of whole-scale project, we're looking at broadening the range of partners that we work with. So we're working with councils increasingly and other NGOs that are supporting nature restoration in the UK, so RSPB, the National Trust, quite a range of ones.
Yeah, I also was super inspired by the People's Plan for Nature in terms of, obviously we work a lot with different groups and different organisations in government department and civil servants, but also really kind of having that space to bring people from across the country and hearing their views on nature was really inspiring and powerful for me.
Yeah, definitely.
This one we probably could both answer, which is, what's the best way to support charities that are helping stop climate change? So, I mean, I feel like one of the strongest things we can all do is using our voice. And I think in terms of politicians and businesses, really hearing from people that care about climate change, that are concerned about climate change, I think that's really important. And WWF often has actions that speak to that. We've just had a Write Your MP around nature. There's lots we kind of put out on our social media channels, so following us on Twitter and Instagram, and also various different LinkedIn. We do a load of blogs and stuff as well. And then at the moment we have the Climate Recovery Fund, so we're fundraising money to make sure that we're really addressing this problem and investing in projects that help reduce the impacts of climate change, but also to fund the work that we're doing around influencing government and making sure we're holding our leaders to account on climate change. And then, I think any other kind of ways?
No, I think you've covered it really. I think that kind of, that showing that people care. I think obviously, like we've got these targets, but it is the what do we do next? How do we implement those? And really making sure that we're holding government to account for doing that. And I think demonstrating that it's an issue that the public care about is really important, particularly as we come up to a kind of a general election and potentially a new government, kind of demonstrating to those new people that will be in power how important responding to the climate and nature crisis is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of keeping an eye out in terms of what charities are putting out there and showing support is really important in the areas that you care about. And as you say, kind of going into general election, I suppose kind of hearing from you and politicians and going to speak to MPs is really important. And I suppose when we interact with those MPs, we hear that very much from them in terms of the strength of when they've heard from people, really amplifies what we're trying to say at WWF and other organisations as well. In terms of that really comes up a lot. Yeah. We've got another one in for Lucy. What types of flowers could we plant that would help the bees and butterflies that are suffering?
So wildflowers are really good for that. So putting and looking, there's lots of different kind of wildflower mixes now. So that kind of range of different flowers that kind of are then a sustained kind of source of pollen and nectar for pollinators over a period of time, I think is really important. We're looking at sort of certainly in the work that we're doing, kind of those local seed mixes and how you can, if you restore a wildflower meadow, how can you then harvest those seeds and use them then to restore further areas. So obviously that kind of seed isn't always available to the public, but I think that real kind of local, kind of making sure that it is the type of flowers that will be suitable for pollinators in that area.
Yeah. I think we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your questions. It's been a really interesting debate, and I'm sure we can keep engaging through social media channels in this space. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if you want to hear more about our work in the UK, we've got an amazing YouTube series bringing nature back to life. So please go and check that out. You can see stories of the work that we're supporting across the UK and the amazing people that are kind of working at local level to really help restore nature. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.